Hello, welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing my 14.24b top lane tier list. So if you enjoy the content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There weren't a huge amount of changes in the B patch. It was mostly focused around bringing down some of the outliers. That was a nerf towards Warwick after his already pre-existing hotfix nerf. A nerf towards Victor as he was overperforming in mid bot lane and doing alright in top lane as well. And then a slight nerf to Tahm Kench. It doesn't do a huge amount as a free armor nerf. Mostly because like a tweet surfaced of a Jinx fighting a Tahm Kench and almost losing, and that prompted enough. It was really interesting to see how that whole dynamic like functioned, but here we are. So that did happen, and then I wanted to shift some other things around, talk about some of the other champions, and just more precisely put everything in the right spot going into next year. Obviously, there will be a lot of things changing. It's a new season with new mechanics, so it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But the D tier is going to consist of a couple of changes. So Kane and Lee are my two additions. Someone was asking for Kane to be added. I'm pretty sure the Baus was promoting this once again as like an option within the top lane. I've never been a huge fan of Kane top. He struggles into most laners, has mana problems, his sustain's pretty bad if you're ever really put quite far behind, that coming from the E. Obviously what you tend to see, like alternating between like some WQ max variants or like 3 points Q into W max. We've seen 3 points W into Q max. There are different ways you can play this. I'm not a huge fan of it though. I think it has a lot of clear issues which really prohibit it from existing up here. So yeah, I'm going to leave them in the D tier. Lee Sin, obviously we all remember the E max score drinker Lee Sin of the past. He seems to have gained some level of play rate. I believe Lee is just a popular champion, which is why he has some bleed over into the top lane. He doesn't perform that well here anymore, but he changed his E quite heavily to scale with base AD rather than bonus AD to try and kind of make it less egregious in terms of putting points into the ability, as it had a sharper scaling through that. Overall, yeah, the champion doesn't really function that well in the top lane, but like most things, you can still make it work, especially if you are very aggressively snowballing or very good at piloting the pick. The other champions here are the likes of Smolder, who is gradually losing his play rate in the top lane, rightfully so. This champion is in a pretty rough spot for both solo lanes, like he doesn't perform that well here anymore. In the bot lane, he's still a very viable marksman. We've seen like different build variations, but yeah, in the solo lanes, you're primarily picking him as like a scaling option into tanks, with the same kind of philosophy of why you would pick Kale. But yeah, Smolder gonna be within the D tier for the moment. Yasuo can still definitely function against some of the ranged options in the top lane. He is also a very demanding champion, and for a mid/low elo, or like a gold to diamond encompassing tier list, he's not a pick I'm going to primarily recommend, as you're more often just going to play him if you're auto-filled from mid to top. He can still very function in those counter pick scenarios where you are playing against the likes of Twisted Fate top, which we obviously don't really see anymore, but there are some of the ranged matchups where you can definitely find your footing and still be a very viable option. He's going to remain in the D tier though at the moment, as he does get run over by most bruiser options, and then struggles into tanks if he's not accelerated within the game and has like the kind of team composition to answer them on the side lanes. Rumble is actually going to move up, so I won't talk about him yet, but Jace is going to maintain his spot within the D tier, obviously gaining a huge spike in popularity from Arcane. No surprise that he ended up with a pretty aggressively deflated win rate, dropped by almost like 3% from that. He is gradually gaining back some of that, but Jace just in his current state is in a pretty bad spot for across all elos. He can still function high though. Like, he's a very demanding champion and requires like good knowledge of the the pick, what you want to do with it, what keystone options you want, how you're going to mechanically outplay the enemy champion. So lots of depth to this champion, and this pick I just really wouldn't recommend learning early on into the game. Once you've got a lot of mastery in the game and like you're willing to put a lot of practice into Jace, he can definitely be a champion which can function within your arsenal, but he does have some pretty steep matchups which can be really punishing if you're not executing the champion well. Our pick moving down is Udyr. I think Udyr was still slightly overrated. This champ seems to have just lost all of its traction in the top lane. It was very oppressive for a while, back when his R did a huge amount of damage and could allow him to really comfortably cheese some matchups with his level 1 strength. That is so much weaker now, and he, without that kind of like damage, but almost extra damage on top, really struggles into specific, like, or just most matchups now. He just doesn't have the same level of fighting power. It's kind of like Skarner top, where Skarner lost a lot of his, like, excess damage, and that really punished him in this role, because it means that you're no longer going to be able to consistently look for chip angles. You have to just find all-ins with the likes of your jungler, and solo kills are kind of off the table at this point, so Udyr sits within the D tier now. Rumble does move up. I opened up some space, obviously, with a bunch of champions coming down to the D. Oh, I say bunch of champions. Udyr coming down to the D tier, and 2 other additions being added on. Rumble moves up as a C tier option. I still think this champion is very hard to pilot. Requires very demanding amounts of lane pressure. Requires you to be snowballing, and then utilizing that to close out games. He's not a pick I'd really recommend early on into the game, but the recent buffs have definitely helped him, and can move him up to the C tier because of it. The likes of Cassante and Ambessa are still very hard to pilot picks. Cassante is deemed the best tank within the top lane in Elite. In low elo, he's probably the worst tank option you can go to. They're requiring very, very dominant laning phase and execution of the champion. Just not a pick I'm really going to recommend. Ambessa also sits within the C tier. The nerf towards her W really hurts her, specifically in low elo, more than anything. It makes it so that she can't really have the room to mess up where she might have once before, just losing so much shielding. So yeah, drops down to the C tier. Definitely not a pick I'm going to recommend, unless once again you're willing to put a lot of time into it. She can still definitely function into a lot of the matchup pool, but does also have some very steep ones. Renekton is the likes of which come to mind. Varus, Vayne are still my C tier marksman option. They can definitely still function into specific matchups, primarily mobile tanks. Vayne and Varus, both have good amounts of percentage damage within their kit, and can have a level of fight back against that. I think he can scale up relatively well. Varus obviously has the really powerful pick potential with his ultimate. Vayne has the isolated 1v1 potential, which can make her really oppressive on sides when really far ahead of the curve. Quinn, also another marksman within the top lane. She's kind of just lost her identity over time. We've seen some different variations of like standard Quinn, or some like lethality variations where you're picking up like a symbiotic souls. I still think Quinn mid is probably slightly better still, albeit Profane Hydra got quite aggressively nerfed when they did the item nerfs back in 14.19, so she has definitely lost some level of power from that. She sits as a C tier option at the moment. Gwen, Fiora, Yone, all these picks, great high elo options into specific matchups. The Yone Aatrox matchup, for example, Fiora into tanks, Gwen into a lot of the tank pool as well. These picks do all have their angles of strength. Yone obviously also really good into tanks, but definitely really hard to pilot, require a lot of games and mastery on the champion to really execute them well. So they're just not really going to be picks which I recommend in low elos. Obviously, Ambessa kind of falls into the same bracket at this point. And then Riven is also here. Relatively similar reasons of just requiring a lot out of the mastery of the champion, understanding the execution of her combos, and usually with just kill thresholds to kind of snowball and get the advantages you need within the game. Vladimir moves up. The champion's doing a lot better at the moment. He's actually like a high B2 option. I had Vladimir kind of lingering underrated from the whole Grasp WMAX the Vladimir incident, where people kind of stuck to that build for too long. Now that people have mostly just moved over, Vladimir is doing a decent amount better. He's also found his footing into some of the tankier matchups. We even saw him in the Demacia Cup a couple days ago, where we saw Vladimir into Maokai, mostly because it forces Maokai into an uncomfortable state of having to rush spirits, and Vladimir can kind of freely scale in a lane like that. So Vladimir definitely doing a lot better at the moment, sits as a B tier option. Some of the champions moving down are Victor, who got nerfed this patch, or got nerfed in the B patch. They took away some of his armor and health growth, and it hurt him. It hurt him primarily in the top lane, so he drops from the B tier to the C tier. He's still a very solid mid laner and bot laner, still one of the best at the moment, but yeah, definitely doing a bit worse in the top lane. He's going to struggle into some of those bruiser matchups, and really does struggle in side lanes with that loss of health and armor, especially into the likes of Riven, Yone, who can isolate him out and then kill him pretty comfortably. Pantheon and Jax also moved down. Jax has been on the decline for a while, ever since they nerfed his R. He's just been struggling a lot more. Still really struggles into matchups like Garen. Like, if you want a Jax counter, Garen is still really good in those spots, albeit Garen is slightly weaker than he has been in previous like splits and seasons. He does well into Volibear. Like, that is primarily one of the reasons why you're still going to be playing Jax. I believe the Volibear and the likes of the Yone matchup can be quite beneficial for you. I believe there's one more off the top of my head which I just can't remember at the moment, but yeah, there are a couple of matchups which you can still definitely function to quite well. Aurelia, that's the one. Aurelia, with her surge of popularity, is Jax can still very much function into that matchup quite well. And then your Pantheon. I haven't been a fan of Pantheon for a while. This champion is very predicated on snowballing. Do I even have him? I'll add him back. He's been very predicated on snowballing for a while, requiring very aggressive leads through laning phase to kind of function later on. It's like even more egregious than the likes of Volibear, who also is very dependent on early kills to kind of find his footing within the game. Pantheon is just not a champion I'm going to recommend at the moment, unless you are pushing him to his limit, maximizing every sort of like output of the champion. Then he can be really oppressive in lane, and that is where you can find your wins on the champion. If you want to obviously watch someone who plays a lot of Pantheon, I'd recommend Spear Shot. He's very, very good at the pick. Other than that, though, just not something I'm really going to recommend at the moment. Swain is fine. Swain can still very much function into a lot of the tank pool lanes, kind of, which can't really assail him that well, can't really play around his ultimate as easily, and he can kind of, just get to that mid game and fight objectives kind of how he would like to do. Obviously, he struggles as like a blind pick, but he has flex potential, albeit he's slightly weaker in both mid and bot, and then pretty weak in support now after the nerfs down, so sits as like a low B tier pick at the moment. Olaf, still great as an anti-tank, still great into matchups dependent on their CC. He can very much function as a counter pick in those angles. Still struggles into a lot of the bruiser pool though, and champions which can kind of just buy out the ultimate time. Those are the matchups where he really does struggle into, plus the fact that his items are a bit weaker at the moment. There are some clear weaknesses to the champion which kind of prohibit him from being in a higher tier. Camille is slightly weaker with the nerfs she received back along, but she kind of found her spot as like a low B2 option. Once again has kind of gone back to being more of a counter pick dependent champion, but if you find the angles, she can still be very oppressive on the sides, especially into champions which just don't have the tools to match her. Gangplank, I think, is underrated at the moment, especially in Elite. For average play, he's still a very, very hard champion to pilot, and a pick I'm not going to recommend unless you have a lot of mastery. But if you have a lot of mastery on Gangplank, you're detonating your barrels like efficiently, and you're like maximizing the value of the champion. He is in an incredibly good spot at the moment. Definitely a pick I would recommend playing if you do have the mastery. Garen is still a relatively simple champion and still has great matchups which he can really abuse, but he's definitely weaker than he has been in the previous split with the nerfs towards his itemization. There is still definite strengths to Garen though, his obviously obvious simplicity, his ease of his scaling, his like some of the keystone options you have in both Conqueror and Phase Rush. The builds are still like relatively simplistic, like you've got your Stride Breaker, Deadmans, or your Stride Breaker PD, and then you've got some like crit variations, or you just have like standard tank variations. I think Garen is still a very solid option. I'd have him as like a mid to high B tier pick. Gragas is a great neutralizer, one of the best elite picks in the game still. Definitely struggles in low elo though, low to mid elo. The nerfs towards his sustain have meant that he is not as good at holding lane as he has been in previous iterations. It also hurts primarily low elo, where you are going to oftentimes take more chip damage, and having that excess healing was really beneficial there. Overall, he's definitely a bit weaker in his current state for like average play, but still very solid in Elite, so if you do want to put time into Gragas, he's still definitely an option which I would recommend. Kled is very niche, but can still be very effective if you play him well, forcing you to be very aggressive in early laning phase. And like his tower dives are some of the best within the game. I think Kled is in a very solid spot at the moment, especially if you play the champion. Tryndamere is in an unhealthy spot, but he's still fine. Like, he's hard to assail. This champion has so much sustain in the likes of Second Wind, D-Shield, Grasp, Fleet, Ravenous Hydra. it makes him very hard to kind of ever like push him out of lane. He does struggle more into champions, which can oftentimes just like buy out the time of his ultimate, or can just like hold him, and into compositions where it's like going to be relatively hard to side lane because you are needed to team fight. That is where a Trinidad's weaknesses really show, but he can still definitely find his footing in the game at the moment, especially with how hard he is to assail. Akali, I think, is in a pretty good spot for top lane at the moment. I think in Elite and into specific matchups, she's definitely up there as a pretty underrated pick, especially with some of the build variations kind of flying around at the moment, that being the likes of Deadman's. She's going to be a bit hard to pilot up than some of the other options, but if you find the matchups which suit you, I definitely do think Akali can be a champion which you fit into your top lane pool at the moment. So yeah, definitely play her if you enjoy her. If you don't enjoy her, then she's not necessary to play by any means at the moment, so I'd still leave her as like a B2 option. Sidus is primarily a counter pick to Malphite. Honestly, this champion could probably be like a low B2 option because you are only seeing him into specific matchups where you can really just abuse the value of their ultimate, or you can kind of freely do what you want to do around the map. Obviously, the Gnar matchup can be pretty nice for Sidus with that ultimate being very powerful on him, but you're primarily just playing him as like a Malphite answer just because of how strong the ultimate is on him. Kennen, Gnar, Aurora are some of the best elite ranged options in the game at the moment. I think Aurora is number one in my opinion. Gnar and Kennen are very close though. They are very good options, especially if you find the right spots for them. But for average play, I'm going to leave them as like B2 options. But once again, if you know how to play these champions, they are going to be your go-to. They are going to be things I really do recommend playing throughout all the ranks into higher elo. Dropping down is Darius. I think Darius I had still slight. I moved Darius back up into the A tier, but I think I shouldn't have done that. I think I should have just left him in the B tier. He just hasn't really found his footing ever since the Ghost and the Stridebreaker nerfs, and that really did hurt him, so I really do think he probably should have just kept his B tier spot, but he can still be very oppressive early on into the game. Obviously, he requires you to close out the game, but you can still find those team fights later on into the game, like where you can utilize your level 16 guaranteed ult reset on kill. He can still definitely be a very effective pick, so I think Darius still is a good option if you enjoy that kind of champion, just not quite the A tier pick which I had him as in the previous patch, well, in this patch, but like slightly early on. Sett leads off the A tier. He's fine. Kind of akin to like actually like Darius and Garen. I mean, actually, I'll say Darius and Garen are slightly weaker, but yeah, Sett is fine. If you can really abuse his early game and you have the matchups like which you want to pick him into, he can be quite effective. He does a lot of damage. He has a decent amount of CC. He can oftentimes be a pretty solid peel option as well, which is why obviously the likes of Sett support have functioned in the past, and I think he's a solid A tier pick, especially once you have like your Stridebreaker online. It's very hard to like outrun this champion, and he can oftentimes just, if he can sit on you and just output as much damage as possible, then he is a very strong option. Aurelia. So Aurelia is probably number one top laner in the game at the moment for like Diamond Master going into Grandmaster. I don't know if I'd have her as the best, go like right up into Elite. The problem with Aurelia though is her mastery curve is like really steep. So that like once you've hit like if you're an Emerald and you play a lot of Aurelia and you are good at the champion, she is a pick I would almost guarantee you should be playing in most games. It's like in Diamond you should be playing Aurelia. Like this champion is very good. Like that, if you have the mastery on the champion. Obviously, if you don't have the mastery on the champion, she's probably still not going to be a pick I recommend. But it's like Rumble to like Warwick. Like a good Rumble will beat a bad Warwick. That's just how the game functions. There aren't going to be that like egregious levels of like matchups almost. But yeah, like Aurelia, if you are good at Aurelia, pick the champion. She's in an incredible spot at the moment. This is primarily because of the kind of uprise of Hullbreaker second. She is looking incredibly strong in the item. She was probably incredibly strong in the item back pre the tower buff to Aurelia when they did the changes in 14.22. Just no one really played it. I mean, I say no one played it, like full stop. Like there were like 100 games on Hullbreaker full stop. This patch, it's like comfortably her most popular second item. So we've gone really aggressively from like this item not being built to being like her core second option. She'll probably get nerfed in 14. There is no 14.25. She'll get nerfed probably going into the new season. I imagine Riot won't be happy with where she is at the moment. We saw some stuff on PBE, but then they got taken away. So I don't know where this champion's going to land going into next season. But at the moment, if you play Aurelia, she is the best option in the game. You should be, just playing this champion. She'll be almost free LP if you're good at her. Renekton, still a very solid A tier option. He's pretty solid just across the game in terms of what you want him to provide. He is a point and click CC option with good early game damage, good mid game damage, good objective control. He'll fall off later onto the game, but he can just act as a body, and I think there's just a lot of value to Renekton. Obviously, his laning phase isn't quite as strong as it has been in the past, and that can be like a pain point of the champion compared to like maybe what you want it to be, but he is definitely in a solid spot at the moment, a good A tier pick. The other A tier options then are the likes of Alawi, who is a great low elo option but quite aggressively falls off the higher rank you go. Good into the likes of tanks and matchups which can't really function against her E. That is the places where I would recommend playing her. Wukong, great into AD matchups where you can really utilize your passive and your trading potential. He spikes really aggressively on one item, 1-2 items, and then works really nicely as like a mid to late game team fighter. His ultimate is one of the strongest in the game. Poppy is a great champion into high mobility picks which can't really function against her W. Definitely leaning more towards Cindered Sky variations now with the AD ratio buff on her Q, and then some nerfs towards her base values. That definitely did hurt her primarily in the support role, but you can kind of make it up in the top lane when you are playing like a Cindered Sky. My personal favorite build is like Cindered Sky, Fimbulwinter, Spirits, or Unending Despair, and then the other option depending on what you need within the game. And then you can even wrap it up with the likes of Asterix, and she is this unkillable shield printing tank bruiser which does a lot for the game and can neutralize a lot of champions. I think she's still a great A tier option and an S plus tier pick in the right spots. Aatrox on the correct build variations is a great A tier pick. If you're playing like Sundered Sky and you're not opting into like Voltaic Cyclosword, I think he could probably drop down to the B tier. But if you're playing like your Cyclosword Trojan variants, he is in a very good spot at the moment. I'd still have him as a good A tier pick. KO is great in low elo. Once again, like Alawi, like falls off quite aggressively the higher up you go. Has pretty nice time into tank matchups and champions which can't really ever look for individual kill potential on her, allowing her to kind of freely scale up on sides and be really strong like on her later game spikes with like a Rabadon level 16. KO is a very hard champion to kind of fight against and can really comfortably win from those spots. Heimerdinger and Singed are pretty unique in terms of the fact that they have very, very OTP heavy player bases. If you understand these champions, they will do work for you. Like, I think Heimerdinger is very underrated in its current state. I think Singed is also in a very solid spot at the moment. So 2 picks I'd definitely recommend learning if you enjoy their playstyles. If you don't enjoy their playstyles, they're not mandatory by any means. They're just unique and most people don't understand a huge amount of how to play against them. Shen, still a solid tank option. Bit weaker after its nerfs, but can still definitely function in the top lane. Well, I mean, say function. Like, Shen's still a really good option, actually. Like, his W nullifies a lot of the auto-attack dependent matchups. He will struggle into a lot of the AP options, though. Like, your Auroras, your Mordekaisers, for example, are going to be real pain points for Shen. I wouldn't say he's blindable by any means, but he's still definitely a good A-tier pick. Ornn, I'd have slightly lower than Shen, primarily because he just doesn't have the same level of agency in a lot of situations. But Ornn, at like his level 13 to like 17 breakpoints when you're getting items upgraded for teammates, is a very valuable champion, and I think as a tank like who outputs a decent amount of damage, he can be a very valuable addition to your draft. Your split pushing options are like your Yoriks, your Trundles, your Nasus's. These picks all have strengths in their own ways. Nasus tends to be a bit more polarizing depending on what kind of actually all 3 of them are pretty polarizing against what laners you are like opting them into. Trundle is great as like an anti-tank, anti-AD option. Struggles into a lot of the AP picks and struggles into heavy kite. Yorick is going to struggle into the likes of Aurelia, who's very strong at the moment. Definitely a recommended ban. but can very comfortably overwhelm champions with not good tools to kind of play against this W. Nasus' Wither tends to be the polarizing point in a lot of matchups. If you can wither enemy champion and it really prohibits them from being able to do anything, he can have a lot of value in those situations. The likes of Kale, for example, really struggles into Nasus. That is a matchup I would always recommend trying Nasus into and just learning for the sake of how strong he can be in those spots. Cassiopeia and Rise are really solid A tier options within the top lane as like AP picks, and I'll have Teemo just like alongside them. I think Teemo tends to be a bit better more generalistically, but it still tends to be pretty locked to like auto attack dependent champions, whereas Cassiopeia and Rise tend to be a bit more comp dependent. They don't want to play into range, they want to play into matchups which they can kind of utilize their kiting power and movement speed to really be quite potent. Rise, I would say, is slightly weaker than Cassiopeia at the moment, but both of them can really function quite well if you are good at if you're good at the picks. Galio, I'm going to drop down to the B tier. I had Galio slightly overrated. I think this champion is too dependent on the matchups he wants to be playing in to really be an A tier pick. But if you are comfortable in Galio and you really enjoy the champion, then he can definitely be quite a successful top laner still. He can also work on a relatively low budget, so if you ever find yourself quite stunted within the game, he can still definitely be a valuable pick, kind of akin to the likes of Malphite, for example. Sion, Cho, still solid A tier tanks. I think Sion's slightly lower down, primarily because people don't understand how to play the champion as much. He is actually a very solid lane bully, and honestly, Cho'Gath can be as well with the amount of sustain and base damage he has. Both these champions are kind of misunderstood in how they can function in the game at the moment. Zac is a bit weaker with the Q nerfs, but can still function as a solid A tier pick, so I still have him here. And Malphite is my final A tier option. I think Malphite is still very, very polarized in terms of being valuable into AD matchups, but can struggle into a lot of the AP picks. You're oftentimes only really picking him as like a B4, B5 or an R5 option, and that is where you're really going to get value out of the pick. And then my S tier, there are no S plus options at the moment. Warwick got quite aggressively nerfed, but honestly, I'll go back to front. I think Mundo, definitely a lot weaker with the E nerfs. He's still solid as a tank option in the top lane, and if he can scale throughout the game, he is one of the most tanky champions. Once you hit your level 16 to 18 breakpoints, it is very hard to shut this champion down unless you have a huge amount of percentage health damage. Tahm Kench is weaker with the free armor nerf, but still very valuable. I think Mordekaiser and Volibear can also sit around here. These are probably my four slightly lower options. Maokai can sit slightly above them. I think Maokai is probably the best tank option in mid-elo. I think Mundo is still probably the best tank option in low-elo. Maokai, great builds at the moment with Unending Despair, Fimbulwinter, Spirits trio. That makes him basically unkillable into most team compositions. His damage is on his Q, once you get a couple points into it, is very valuable as well. And his vision control and CC are so valuable. I think this champion is one of the best mid-game, mid-elo tanks at the moment, and you should really be playing him if you're around that bracket. What was I going to say about Mordekaiser and Volibear? Both of them do a huge amount of damage, especially if they can stick to their target. They struggle really aggressively into range and specific matchups. The likes of Jax is horrible for Volibear. He really struggles in that situation, and Volibear is really predicated on getting early advantages. Not so much as Mordekaiser isn't as much. Mordekaiser tends to be more built around his mid game and isolating targets and controlling that to force objectives. Both these picks still very solid S2 options. And then Warwick and Urgot. I think Warwick sits as more like a mid S2 option now. The nerfs have kind of brought him back to where he was in the previous patch. Obviously, he was still slightly strong in the previous patch, so he still maintains his spot within the S tier, but definitely, I think he feels better to play as a champion. The ban rate hasn't dropped down anywhere near as much as his pick rate, so that will have some lag, but over time that should come down. So if you do enjoy playing Warwick, you'll start to see your champion not banned as much. And then Urgot, I think, is an incredible champion at the moment. Does a huge amount of damage, can oftentimes just sit through most lanes, hit his level 13 and be really oppressive later on into the game with some of the build variations and your showed not Shojin Rush, I'm missing an item here. Cleaver into Shojin, into Sterox or Overlord's Bloodmail, even like Shybreaker Rush into ranged compositions. I think Urgot is relatively flexible at the moment still. Obviously, Lethality Urgot's kind of not that viable anymore, but you can still just play standard Urgot and still find equal amounts of success. PTA, Phase Rush are the keystone options, and I would recommend taking TP or Ignite depending on what you feel comfortable with in the specific game states. Overall, I think the champ's in a great spot at the moment, a great S tier pick. Yeah, I think the S tier has a really solid option of champions to go to. Good amount of tanks, good amount of bruisers. Not so much range, but when ranged is more elite skewed anyway, so if you're looking for some of those, they're still very good and you still have options for you. Some of the AP options are kind of prohibiting, like you are mostly looking at Mordekaiser for your main AP option, but things like Cassiopeia, Rise can be great in specific matchups, and Teemo is a very solid option. So you do have a lot of champions you can opt into, and yeah, those are my thoughts. So thank you guys for watching. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.